Good afternoon, Varushka. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Good afternoon, Warwick. I'm good, and you?
Okay, thanks. Varushka, I'm just setting everything up to go to YouTube quickly.
Okay. Warwick, I just need to sort I'm not sharing my screen, but I need my screen up. Oh, where do I? Okay, I need to get my screen up. Am I recording already live?
You are live, yes, but it doesn't matter.
Okay,
Are you wanting to share your screen?
I don't want to share my screen, but I want to have a look at my screen. So
okay. Right. Varushka, I currently see we have two attendees. So we got two students. What I'm going to do is, if you would like this, if we don't get any additional attendees by 2:15, I'm going to allow our attendees to be able to talk. But for the two attendees who are there, if we do allow you to talk, please will you just keep your microphones muted until you have a question, and then you can unmute yourself, and then you can ask Varushka the question. Is that okay with you, Varushka?
That's perfect, Warwick. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, Varushka, it's nearly 2:05. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
Okay. So if you want to start, and as I say, I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. If we get a maximum of 5 people, then I will allow those 5 students to talk and ask questions. But if we get more than 5, I'm just going to keep it blank. All right.
Okay.
Or else it'll be perfect overload for you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Warwick.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself now, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, students. Welcome back to our second webinar of History 400. And this week, I'm going to be continuing with Chapter 5 on Afrikaner politics. Just to recap, last week, I discussed a bit about the politics from 1910, who were the main players on stage, the prime ministers, what the politics were as far as the parties were concerned. So I want to continue from there. And this week, I want to mainly concentrate on segregation and discrimination. Right? So let's continue. Now, by 1910, when South Africa became a union, right, we all are aware that the white population had conquered the indigenous inhabitants of South Africa. Okay, so this was a progression of subduing the Black population, right? And we're going to go through it step by step. So at this point in time, some of the I refer to Black South Africans as Africans, right? Because that is how it's referred to in your textbook. So I don't want to create any confusion. So some Africans were still subsistence farmers by 1910. Right? So they had either bought the land from white farmers or they were still living on the reserves that were created by the colonial government. Right? And however, from 1910, there was a comprehensive program to divide the race groups, to create that racial segregation and discrimination. Right? And the idea behind this was to obviously to gain control of the African people. So in order to do this, the Union government or the South African government, which was, like I said, at that time was called the Union of South Africa, they did this by introducing a number of laws. Now, the first and most significant law was the Native Lands Act. And this act prohibited Africans from purchasing land or leasing land out of the reserves. Okay, so this basically, limited African people to the reserves. Now, remember, they were still farming on the reserves, but the reserves were subsistence farming, right? These reserves were later what we call the homelands. So it was referred to in the apartheid government as the homelands, right? All this act further prohibited Africans some sharecropping in the Orange Free State. So sharecropping was where, for example, a farmer would lease a part of his land out to African farmers, and he would, perhaps they would pay him by virtue of some crops, or sometimes they would even lease it out and they would pay him for it, right? So this act actively prevented that. Right, and then, we find that when this act was passed, there was like a mass urbanization of African people to the towns and the cities, and we're going to look at that a little bit more, right? The reserves at this time formed about 12% of the whole of South Africa. Let us look at the reserves themselves. In the years that followed 1910, the reserves started deteriorating, right? Because the amount of people put on small pieces of land could not sustain that type of population. There was a whole concentration of subsistence farming and livestock on little pieces of land. And with the result that we found that, the vegetation there started dying out. It was, overuse of the land. Water holes started drying out. They started experiencing soil erosion. And, it wasn't long before these people were not able to be productive on this land. Also, with the reserves, that we find that the government had built a lot of railways and roads in order to assist or sustain white farmers. And these reserves are very far from the railways or the roads. So even if farmers, these small farmers, African farmers, were hoping to get their produce to the markets, there was nothing to assist them. There was no government support. It made it very difficult without proper roads and railway lines to get mass production to markets. So they were very severely neglected. And as a result of this, a lot of the people in the reserves could not even produce enough food to feed themselves. Their resources were so limited. And in addition to this, the government introduced taxes to the people in the reserves, right? After 1925, there was a poll tax introduced whereby all African males over the age of 18 had to pay this tax. Now, if we look at this, right, we have to look at the underlying reason now. Why would you only tax males over the 18? And the reason for this was because they were workforce, right? Faced with the declining of quality of life, with the shortage of food, with malnutrition that was happening in the reserves, there was no choice for the African males but to go into the cities and find work. Right? Also, you must remember there was no education provided on the reserves, except that was provided by the missionaries. Right? The government did not make any provision for education of African children. So, in essence, the reserves became a harvesting grounds for cheap labor, unskilled labor that would benefit white farmers and the industrialists. The result of this was, again, obviously, that's why African males flocked to the cities, and nearly all of males between the ages of 15 and 50 left the reserves to find work either on the farms or in the towns. Now, this exodus to the cities was not confined to Africans only, but also to some of the whites who were being squeezed out of their farming by large commercial agriculture that was taking place at the time. Successful farmers were being funded and supported by the government to commercialize their farms. They were being encouraged to buying modern equipment and to produce more food. So obviously this was a great plan of the government, right? And later we see when apartheid laws, later on in our year, when we come to the apartheid laws, you'll see how this was designed in order to sustain the South African economy. Okay, now in addition to this, right, you have African males flocking to the towns and the cities. So obviously, you would find a problem there. So with the influx of Africans to the cities and towns in search of employment, the government had to then gain control of who was entering. That's when they introduced the pass laws. Now remember, when I talk about pass laws in South Africa, we all think about the Dom Pass. However, this pass laws goes back to the 18th century and can be traced back to slavery, where slaves on a farm were given a type of pass when they wanted to leave the farm for some or the other reason, right? So that's where passes get traced back, right? It was where movement was controlled. That's how slavery movement was controlled. And later, this same type of system was used in South Africa to limit African people's movement from rural areas into towns and cities. And so basically, African people were prevented from working or entering the cities unless they had a pass, which would state that they were working or they have employment in the city. So in other words, if you do not have employment in the city, you will not be given a pass and you cannot enter the city. So I want you guys to please read more on this in your textbook on page 166 to 167. So now, at that time, right, the gold mines was a huge industry. In fact, the gold mines produced 1/5 of the country's net income. And this drew a lot of workers from within South Africa and the neighboring countries. So we find that a lot of African people went into the gold mines, African males went into the gold mines in order to find work. By 1939, the gold mines employed 364,000 workers, of which 43,000 were white workers and 321,000 were African workers. So it just shows you how, what the numbers were of African males in the towns and the cities. So when we see all these people, all these males, flocking to the cities, you obviously, the government had to keep up these policies of segregation and discrimination, right? And by this, they started introducing more laws. In 1911, when there was a strike on the mines by the white workers, we find that the government, then prohibited the strike in favor of the mine owners, the mining magnates, right? Because the mining magnates wanted to have more Black people doing skilled work, but paying them the same rate, right? This was a way of them cutting down costs. However, this didn't work, and we find that this strike was crushed by the Smuts government, right? This actually caused him the next election, right? Sorry, that was in 1922, okay? The resistance against Smuts. And we find that because Smuts had taken the part or sided with the mining magnates in 1924, he lost the elections to have so. Right, so I don't want to concentrate so much on the politics of it and who was in power at that time. I just want to concentrate on the laws mainly, right? So we'll just go through that. Then I just want to touch on the mines a little bit, right? The mines were a very harsh place, especially for the African laborers. They were run basically on military lines. The shift bosses and compound managers were all white. The underground, what they call boss boys or boss boys, and the compound indunas were all Black, right? The compounds were the sort of hostels where the African laborers were housed. And the state used its power to discriminate racially in not only in the mines, but in manufacturing industry and public works. Black workers were defined as uncivilized workers, and they were obviously paid lower wages, whereas white workers were defined as civilized workers and paid higher wages. And women were also discriminated in the sense as no women were allowed in the compound. So even if you had a husband living there, you were not allowed to be there. Then in 1922, the government passed what was called the Apprentice Act, which gave white workers a more secure position, right? By setting educational levels for apprenticeship in various trades. So this, in essence, made it impossible for any of the African people to be apprenticed. And since they lacked the means to attain the prescribed levels of education, so again, they were put at a disadvantage. In 1923, the Native Urban Areas Act was passed, which empowered an urban authority to establish an African location, right? So what they realized was there were too many African people, African laborers in the town. This act was passed in order to set up a location, a type of location as we would know it today, where African people could live, right? And this was an attempt to keep urbanization of African people in check. At this stage now, we found South African towns developed a dual form, right? We found we would have a spacious modern town, modern area, should I say, with the business sector where people of all races work during the day. Then we would have suburbs of detached houses, ranging from all sizes, owned by white families and serviced by Black domestics. Okay. So from this, you could see, clearly we had this division of the races. Now, if we go back and you think about it, you have to wonder, what were the African people doing about this type of racial discrimination? Now, let us just look at the logistics of I'm going to call it now, go to Black resistance, right? Because when I talk about Black resistance, I'm going to include the Indian and colored people in this, into this. Now, firstly, we must remember that Black resistance was impeded by cultural and historical differences. By this, I mean there were three different groups. There were the African people, there were the Indian people, and then the colored people. Okay, now the Indian people accounted for more or less 2% of the population. They were then further divided into the Hindus and the Muslim population, and majority of them were found in Natal, in Durban, as we know today, and they were mainly from descendants of the sugarcane farmers, or the sugarcane indentured laborers, should I say, right? That's a correct term. Then we had the colored population, or the colored people, who formed about 8% of the population. They were mainly concentrated in Cape Town. Here within the colored population, we found that they had their own set of problems to deal with, right? And they were also very diverse. We had what was called the Cape Town elite, which formed part of the Muslim people, and Christians formed part of the group, and they were actually used to quite a bit of privileges, because the Cape government had given them voting rights, and before the union they were actually equal to whites, so they were used to this type of equality, and were not very affected by racial discrimination and things like that. So we find that these groups, their struggles were very different, and they had little in common with each other. So you found that because of this, unity was, I wouldn't say impossible, but they didn't see their struggles as common struggles. They were all saw themselves as different people on different parts, fighting different demons or challenges. Okay, so the African population formed 69% of the population. Like I mentioned, many of them lived in the reserves. Now, in the reserves, the chiefs or the herdmen were head of the reserves, right? There were white magistrates that controlled these areas. The missionaries would go in there and educate the children. However, these white magistrates that controlled the reserves, they were the ultimate authority. They could decide what happens in the reserve. But the magistrate in charge of the reserve had very little force at his disposal. He basically relied on the chief or the headman to sort out disputes. He was basically there just to sort out disputes. And like I mentioned earlier, we found that most of the men, well, I don't want to say all of the men, but most of the men, 99% of the men from the ages of 18 and 50, leaving to find jobs in the towns and cities. Now, I want you guys to please, under this section, I want you to look at what were the negative effects of labor migrancy. And this you'll find on page 172. I want you guys to please list it, right? Okay. Then we find the missionaries who were in the reserves, who would come to the reserves. And at this time, there were like about 48 missionary organizations. And they were, ultimately they employed educated people and employed teachers, doctors, nurses, and the clergy to service the community on the reserves. And they ran institutions where African people could learn literary skills, right? So they were of a great benefit to the African population at that time. They formed missionary schools, and where most of the teachers were Africans. However, they were very underqualified. Remember, they didn't have proper education, and the missionaries did not even have enough money to pay them, so they were poorly paid. They were trying to educate the children in the reserves, but they were in the primary schools up to 80 children in a class. The high schools were a little better. And, in fact, in later years, these high schools developed quite good names. For example, if you heard of Adams College in Natal, St. Peter's College in Transvaal, and then there was one in Fort Hare, which was called the South African Native College, and they had established good quality education later, even in the apartheid years. These colleges were run on quite good lines, right? Then when we look at some of the workers, remember I said the workers, men had left to work either on the farms or in the towns. However, these farm workers had very bitter experiences. They were not treated well by the farmers. They were poorly paid, and in most times their labor was abused in many ways. Right. So then we come to the Black resistance, right? Now, there were four main tendencies at that time when it came to Black resistance. We found that, as I said, each group had its own immediate situation, right? And they were all basically concentrating on their own grievances. When we came to the African masses, their grievances were very specific. We find that they held on to their traditional values, and they relied also very heavily on the extensive kingship network. Then we find the chiefs, right? The chiefs and the headmen who basically control their own tribes prior to 1910. We find that they kind of adopted to their loss of autonomy, right? And they succumbed to their role in the white state. Okay, so they kind of adapted. Then we found that amongst that, we found a group of teachers, ministers, lawyers who saw themselves as modernizers of African societies. Now, these people tend to accept the premise of liberal ideology and saw themselves as kind of more civilized than the uneducated masses. Then we find a fourth group, right? This fourth group were totally excluded from modern society and alienated also from traditional society. So these were people that were not educated and were not basically conforming to tradition. Many of these type of people we find joined independent churches and subscribed to an Africanist ideology that had some modern and some traditional elements attached to it, right? So there were four particular groups. So now when we look at resistance in the reserves, right, there were various strategies. There were 8 cases from the Transkei, and I want you guys to look at these cases on page 174. However, in all of these cases where they tried to resist white domination over them, there were very few successes. Also, they had limited contact with the other movements that we'll go through later, the national movement. Right? They basically, if I could say, they were unsuccessful in their attempts. I don't want to put it that rigidly, but generally they were. So later we find that there were three major political groups that grew out of this, right? The first was the African Political Organization, which was formed by the colored group, and they were formed in 1902. They were, basically, okay, let me just go, I'm going to go through okay, sorry. Okay, so no, let's carry on from there. Then we found the second group or second organization was the South African Indian Congress, which was founded in 1923. And the third and last of the major groups was the South African Native National Congress, which was founded in 1912. Now we find that most of these leaders of these groups were Western orientated, middle-class people who had received education in some of the missionary schools and the better schools, right? So their aim was to gain equality with the middle class whites, and to later to extend this to the masses or to their people. Now, let's look at these groups individually, right? We found the South African Native Congress was later called the ANC, and on the PowerPoint that I give you, you find the founding members there. They were mainly mission-educated Christians and qualified as lawyers in England. Under 1939, until 1939, these were under the control of lawyers, clergy, and journalists. Right? They were basically, they protested against each installment of discrimination legislature, and they started from 1913. The ANC in 1914, they sent a delegation to England, but in order to try and get England to help them eradicate the discrimination by the Union government, but this failed. In 1919, they sent another delegation to Versailles, but again, all their protests fell on deaf ears. Right, so nothing. They basically got no help. So when we look at these organizations, right, we found that there were similarities between these organizations, because they were all forming middle class, coming from the middle class, right? So it was middle class leadership, and they were all pursuing corresponding goals for their own people. At some stage, there was cooperation between the ANC and APO. However, this wasn't very successful, and the South African Indian Congress at that time were exclusively just supporting the interests of the Indian population. Okay. However, all three of these organizations cooperated with white liberals, such as Edgar Brooks. Edgar Brooks he represented African people as a senator in 1936. And then we found, I just want to go back a little. In 1919, the South African Institute of Race Relations was founded, and this was an organization that collected and published information about the effects of segregation and discrimination. Now, these were organizations formed by white liberals who were hoping to bring attention to the struggles of the African people. But unfortunately, this did not stir much attention from the white population. After 1921, we found some of the liberals, white liberals, or liberals from all races, formed joint councils to discuss racial problems, right? So that was part of resistance. Then a little later, we found the start of the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which was formed by Clemens Kadali. Clemens Kadali was a mission-educated African from Nyasaland, which is Malawi today. And it was actually a small union amongst dock workers in Cape Town, but expanded to a national movement. And he was one of the first to have all races. He had like 150,000 150,000 Africans, 15,000 colors, and about 250 whites that joined the movement. However, it was purely a rural movement, right? It was mainly a rural movement. The thing is about the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union is that it frustrated Africans who had some education and had the idea of upward mobility, and it was not achieving that. So that was one of its failures. The ICU, which is the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, looked at the ANC as sort of the good boys of resistance, and they felt that they were tied to the apron strings of the white liberals. They were taking ideas from independent churches, Marxism, and the Back to Africa movement. So they were, I would say, a little bit more radical than the ANC was at that time. They made a lot of promises of land repossession and national liberation. And there were a few incidents that occurred in Eastern Cape and Northern Transvaal involving the ICU, but these were not successful. The ICU came to an end when white farmers and government suppressed them ruthlessly, right? So basically, when they ended, there was talk of corruption amongst them, and they became quarrelsome. The leadership became quarrelsome, so they disintegrated by the early 1930s. Then we find the South African Communist Party, right? SACP, which was founded in 1921 by a small group of white intellectuals. This was also one of the only parties that included people from all race groups. However, the SACP was subject to directives from Moscow, and this created a lot of division because they declined in 1928 when the party was given directive to stop their class struggle and to adopt the slogan Black Republic, right? And obviously this would create division because remember I mentioned that they had members from all the race groups. So the party declined from there, but they never really gained a wide following. By 1930 they had about 3,000 members. By 1939 they attracted frustrated members from the South African Indian Congress, ANC, and the APO. So that was basically their decline. Then I want you guys to please look up all the political parties that were around at that time, right? And the acronyms. I've included it on my slide. At the end of my slide. So we've come to the end of this section. So what I will do is I'll put the slide up for you guys to go through, and please note that there are sections where you have to read up and include some work and some sections, notes by yourself. So can I ask, I don't know if you guys can respond. Are there any questions thus far?
Hi, students. You guys have been allowed to talk. You're more than welcome to ask questions to Varushka. All you have to do is just unmute yourself.
Okay. No questions. Okay. So let me just share my screen. I want to go through cartoons with you, right? So this year we've got to tackle cartoons. And I'm going to share my screen there with you guys. Okay. Okay, so this is one of the cartoons that you would come across with the Native Land Act, right? So this cartoon was featured a bit later, right? In the late 1990s or early 1990s, could have been early 1990s, right? So this act was repealed in 1994. Okay, and as we later in the year when we come to the politics of our new democracy and land restitution, we'll look at this more closely at this type of cartoon and what it actually meant. But I want you to think about this, right? I want you to look at this cartoon, and it could be a question in your test, right? As to what is the message of this cartoon, right? Land restoration was an attempt by the government to basically restore land to the impoverished Black population of South Africa, right? And as you can see, there's a snail there, right? And that should tell you something. You can see the woman cooking underneath the act. And if you look at the background, you can see it's basically type of shack dwellings. So I want you to please tell me what is the message of this particular act. Right, so guys, we can just discuss a little bit about your coming test, because we have a little bit of time now. So okay, so your test will be on the previous slide, right? And then this one on white politics. So we're going to go through the one on colonization, and I'll test you on this on white Afrikaner politics. I'm going to leave out the first 3 chapters. So basically you've got to learn chapter 4 and chapter 5. The first 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters, remember you had to read by yourself. It was South Africa prior to colonization. It was mainly about the San and the Khoikhoi and the African farmers and how they came into Southern Africa. So I won't test you on that. So I want you to look closely basically at this cartoon for the test, and there is another one in the previous slide, and that one deals with, we had discussed it in class, it deals with British imperialism. So I want you guys to go through those 2 cartoons. I might test you on any one. That's I want you to look at the details of both. I'm not going to go through much, right? What else? So that will be for your test. Your class task, I've decided that we will do it next semester, because it's something I have to do with you. We have to go through it first before you attempt it. So yes, are there any more questions? Any other questions regarding your test?
Varushka, there are no questions currently on YouTube. And I see that there's no questions in the Q&A, the chats, and our students are keeping very, very quiet. I think they're a little bit nervous to talk on live stream.
Yes, I'm sure. Okay, so that's about it then. I don't have anything more. I've come to the end of that chapter. So guys, basically between last week and this week we discussed chapter 5. So you guys have to go and read up the 2 chapters, chapter 4 and chapter 5, for your test, and go through the PowerPoints. It will probably be mainly MCQs, but as we come closer to the time, I'm going to give you guys more direction on that. That's it, and we continue from there. Next week we'll start with chapter 6. That will be the apartheid years and apartheid laws. Okay, and we continue from there.
Okay, thank you very much, Varushka.
Thank you, Warwick.
Okay, I'm going to
thank you, guys.
End the session for you as per normal. All right, thank you to our 2 attendees. We had a few more, but I think they may have just lost internet connection. I mean, it's approaching the end of the month, so the data struggle is getting even real. All right.
Thank you so much, Warwick.
Thanks, Varushka. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.